Okay, good morning, everyone, and welcome to our October 2025 GPN Speaker Series event. And today we're welcoming Erica Liebman, PsyD from Philadelphia, and she's going to be running a workshop style speaker series event today. So, a little bit of lecture, but also lots of participation and dialogue. So, we're really looking forward to it. Thank you, Erica, for joining us. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah, looking forward to it. So I'm going to hand it over now to Mike Nicola. And by the way, I'm Andrew Babson. I'm the Associate Director of the GPN and co-founder with Mike. And over to you, Mike.
Thanks, Andrew, and thanks, Erica, for being here. I'm just going to say a very brief introduction about the GPN and the relevance of your work to the larger network. So, the Global Possibility Network is an entity designed to bring people together from different professional backgrounds who are either doing research or important practice work or both in areas that promote what we call possibility development for young people and including young adults and even older adults. We've learned over time that the work is important across the lifespan, but the focus has tended to be on later adolescence and emerging or early adulthood primarily. So we have initiatives happening in various countries around the world, including China, Brazil, Vietnam, Turkey, and elsewhere, either research or practice initiatives that are intended to more deeply understand what's happening in different arenas to support youth development in the way we care about it. And we think, Erica, that your work, while being done here in Philadelphia, has implications far beyond it. So what we typically do with these presentations is learn from the speakers and then think about how we share that information with larger audiences so the work can have a larger national and global impact. So I think that's enough for now, and let me turn it over to you, Erica, and let you take it away. But thanks everyone for being here.
Yeah, well, thank you very much. I certainly feel like the issues facing boys and men are something that have a global impact, not just in the US. Of course, I'm going to be talking today more from the perspective of men in the US, United States. So without further ado, we will get started. Today, I'm going to really be trying to highlight like some paradoxes. It is true that men and boys are suffering, and it is also true that they are inflicting pain potentially on other groups of people. And so I want to talk today in as nuanced a way as possible. My goal is to not give answers to what is going on. Of course, I wish I had answers, but my goal is to help ask questions that can help us better understand the topic. I also want to just mention, as a disclosure, I'm a private practice psychologist, and so I operate from my own perspective. I'm not representing any other organizations, and I'm also not presenting my own research, though I am presenting research from organizations that I work with regularly. I'm on the board of Division 51, which is a group of people, a part of the American Psychological Association, who do research and also kind of projects advocating for boys and men in terms of mental health. So I do also want to ask that as we're talking about, I'm going to just ask to go to the next slide, please. I do want to ask, as I'm presenting, from the perspective of starting with some of the problems that are facing boys and men, and then some of the reasons why it's happening, and also solutions, which is also my favorite part of this talk, is going to be solutions. I assume that people will most likely see my energy get a little bit more excited because I like talking about the solutions rather than the problems. I'm going to ask you to do something like in your head, or if you have a piece of paper next to you, to answer the following question. Andrew, could you go to the next slide?
Sure. Did that work?
Yeah, and I'm messaging you in the chat to let
Yep.
you know what to do next. It didn't go to the next slide.
Okay. Let's see here. All right. There we go.
Okay, and so the question that I'll ask you to ask yourself is, on a scale of 1 to 10, how familiar do you think that you are with male psychology? So 10 being the most and 1 being the least. You can just kind of answer it to yourself or write it down. The other thing I'd like to talk about, like you to kind of make note of, whether it's on a piece of paper again or in your mind, is am I experiencing any intense emotions based on something that the presenter, is saying? This is a conversation that any feelings at all are welcome. This can be a controversial conversation, right? Like the state of men and boys right now, like it is a conversation that prompts a lot of feelings. It's a conversation that can divide people. And I think it's really important to, instead of push down some of these emotions we have, to really like to understand them, to take note of them. So if you can move on to the next slide. So first I am going to start with problems. And this is kind of like a trigger warning. I am going to start with a topic related to men's mental health that is like really intense. So if you can advance to the next slide, that topic is the topic of male suicide. This is not just a problem in the United States. Of course, we hear a lot in the media about veterans like dying by suicide, but this is a problem in every country in the entire world, except for 2. So male suicide is not just a phenomenon that we can kind of locate in the United States. This is a problem everywhere. And of course, this is affecting men, but this affects families. This is affecting women. This affects everybody. And it's a very serious problem, right, for it to be so kind of widespread and global. Another statistic that is really heartbreaking, and it is that they complete suicide at the rate of 4 times that of women. That is an astonishing number. 4 times, not twice, not thrice, but 4 times the rate of women. And to put into perspective, that's 40,000 men per year. That is about the same number of women who die with breast cancer on an annual basis. I don't know why the slide is so blurry. Okay. And then a third statistic that about 100 men per day are dying, and a significant proportion of them are veterans. We have to ask ourselves, like, why is this happening, right? I don't think this issue gets as much attention as it should. And here is part of the paradox, right? We talk about men as a privileged group, but then there is this like immense problem with suicide. And so what is happening? And believe it or not, it's actually worse in wealthier countries and for men over 50, which makes it even more of a paradox. The next statistic on the slide, that white men and American Indian men have the highest demographics. Now, the white men is a part of the paradox, right? Like, how could the group of men who considerably have the most amount of privilege, at least on the surface, right? I want to talk about this in a nuanced way, are among the men who die by suicide at the highest rate. And of course, American Indian men, who have been a group of men there's a lot of problems in these communities and not considered very privileged, also are a part of this demographic. As we know, or maybe don't know, but I imagine a lot of people here know that men are not very help-seeking, and that they can even look at suicide as like a rational way to end one's problems. I'm not saying that this can't not be true also for like women who die by suicide, but it is also a very male normed idea that this is just a good way to like deal with my pain. And also there is a use of lethal means, which means you don't get a second chance. So when a man commits to dying by suicide and has these lethal means, like that immediately becomes a part of the statistic. And of course, men are really wary of seeking mental health help. Let me break this down a little bit. So part of that reason, here's my helper behind me, this is Leo. But part of that reason for the wariness to seek mental health support is, one, it violates kind of like this male norm of I need to be independent, I need to figure it out on my own, I can't let anybody know that I'm suffering because I wouldn't be very manly. And there's another aspect of it, which is that men are worried about what is going to happen in like a mental health session. And I think that there's maybe some anxiety, well, all of the anxiety is understandable, but some of that anxiety is really relevant to me and some of the work that I do, which is to try and advocate to APA training programs that train therapists to talk more about how to treat men and how to make male-friendly spaces and even like more friendly male processes. Like, right, therapy may not be the best way for men to seek help, help if it is such a stigmatized thing. Maybe we need to create something new. I think there needs to be more research around this. And something else that is really scary is that the suicide rate is increasing. This problem is not getting better. It is getting worse. So I will linger on this topic a little bit more. Next slide, please. Which is, if we break down the statistics a little bit more, I'm going to ask you to look at the graph first on the right. So the age brackets are only from 55 to 85 plus in this, but you'll see the dark blue represents men and the light blue represents women. So again, some of the data that shows that men are much higher risk for dying by suicide in every single age bracket, and especially note the very last bar, which is men 85 plus. They're at very, very high risk. If you look at the graph on the left, this is from the American Institute of Boys and Men, which I'll talk about them a little bit more as well. You see that for every age bracket, starting at 15 going up to 44, the rates of suicide are increasing. Of course, there are some dips, but even notice the red line, which represents men from 25 to 34, there is a sharp increase. And this is really scary. This is something that we really need to pay attention to. Anyone, I don't know if anyone wants to shout out, unmute yourself, but anyone have any idea of what profession, what occupation, male occupation dies by suicide the most? You just had to guess.
Military?
Okay, that's a great one.
Uh,
Andrew,
Finance,
what's that?
banking.
Samir, finance. Okay, yeah, also a good guess.
First
Policing.
responders.
First responders, policing. Okay, so those of you have mentioned. Oh, go ahead. Sorry, Jackie.
Teachers or doctors.
Okay. All right. I would love to ask everybody the reasons for these. I'm going to pause and maybe I'd ask at the end of the talk, but those of you who are thinking about the trades, you're right on the money. So men who are working in trades, they're more than twice as likely to die by suicide compared to men with degrees. And the suicide rate among men without bachelor's degrees has risen twice as fast for college educated men. This is also astonishing, right? Men are more likely to die than women to die by suicide across all kinds of occupational groups, though. This is not just relegated just to the trade workers. And I will mention here too, this is not something I'm going to get into in my talk, that it's predominantly men who die on the job. But even with all the men that die on the job, men who die by suicide is a much, much larger number than men who die just on the job, right? You think about trade workers, you think about people in construction, oil rigs, all that kind of stuff. There is a high rate of death. These are dangerous jobs that we ask men to do. But the single most likely to die by suicide occupation that Richard Reeves found in some of his research is construction workers. And so, yes, this is also a very surprising thing for me to hear. So if you go to the next slide, please.
Erica, just a quick question on that.
Yeah, of course.
Is there any understanding of why it's construction workers?
Yeah, so I didn't find the evidence for that yet. I can do a little bit of a deeper dive and we can come back to it because I myself found myself curious. Stress, obviously, I guess I can imagine. Low pay, I'm not really sure. But I think some of the work that Richard Reeves has done is he would probably have more of that information. He didn't publish it yet, though. This wasn't a research study. This was kind of like a polling that he's done through American Institute of Boys and Men. But yeah, great question. And so for my last slide on this specific topic, Dr. Sylvia Canetto did a study about why older men are so vulnerable to suicide, and particularly older men of European descent, right? Like there is this paradox of why are men that we consider the most privileged dying by suicide the most? And so she looked at various factors that we all might consider, male, female, anyone, loss of one's partner, loss of, occupation, occupational purpose, loss of mobility. And of course, these things do affect all of us, and some of these factors can affect men more. But what she found was that older white men do not have as good of coping. They have very rigid coping styles. She framed it as like a lack of practice with change. And so the idea that you've been able to get by like on all of these very traditional scripts and roles, and then life hits a point where you need to shift the way you're dealing with life, and there hasn't been any practice of doing so. And so it puts these older men at risk for suicide. Next slide, please. So you think about suicide, and one of the intersections with suicide is economic anxiety. And obviously, I think, we're all awake and alert, and we're aware that, economic realities really affect everyone, and they affect men in a very particular way. So Equimundo, which is also a place, an organization that does a lot of research, they surveyed 2,500 men, women, and non-binary people, and they asked about, some questions to get their sense of everybody's feelings towards the economic stability, the anxieties, and and mental health. And both men and women were really anxious about their financial realities. But men are seeing that the American dream is out of reach, particularly for them. Part of this is because a lot of male norms have been established over a long time, that men are the economic head of the household, that they are the providers. So when there is economic anxiety and providing for one's family, of course, everybody is going to be anxious and very nervous about providing. But men, when this is like tied into the sense of who you are, it becomes a little, it has a different flavor to it. This also translates, into some meaninglessness and purposelessness. And if you look at the sample from Equimundo in 2025, they talked that 86% of the sample of men see being a provider as their primary role. On the left, the little graphic that I have there, it talks about how men who are facing economic anxiety are 16.3 times more likely to have had suicidal thoughts in the past 2 weeks when faced with economic anxiety. Of course, this is true also for women, but we're looking at like a more than double the amount for men. This is really, really affecting men, the changing status of our economy. And men who are experiencing economic anxiety, interestingly, there's an intersection with like ideas about masculinity. So these men are wishing that they were more masculine because, one, this is a way to cope with reality. Like it's like kind of like a defense mechanism. We all have defense mechanisms. But wishing one was more masculine is a particular defense mechanism. And even those in Gen Z were wishing kind of like some of the same thing. If you move to the next slide, please. There is a direct tie to this economic anxiety and the manosphere. I don't know if everybody here has heard of the manosphere, but the manosphere is kind of like a term that talks about the collective group of influencers, online communities. They're often associated with, community and ways of like finding purpose, like how to work out, how to manage one's finances, like how to be a man. But they then spill over, and different ones to different degrees, they spill over into like anti-feminism, misogyny, encouraging behaviors that are maybe feel good for the individual in the moment, but are not good for women. Andrew Tate, I imagine everyone here has heard of Andrew Tate. He's a household name. I'd imagine mostly because of the controversy with him. I don't know that everybody's actually seen his content. He's been banned on a lot of platforms, but he still has 10 million followers on X. He is highly influential. He and A Voice for Men are the two most influential like manosphere places online. And, if you look at some of the content, it's pretty like it can be really disturbing. But imagine, right? Like we have economic anxiety tied to like, what is being a man, and there's changing and shifting gender norms going on in conversations in society in the past 2 years. And then you have these people who are filling a void. Recently on the podcast that I host with my co-host, we invited somebody to talk about the manosphere, and like we all agree that there's a void that's being filled by this content. Like, right, like there's these influencers have come in and kind of have filled a space that needs to be filled with something, but it's just not being filled with content that is, I think, good for men and good for everyone else. In the November 2025 report about the manosphere, what's really interesting is that men find this content inspiring. It makes them feel optimistic. It makes them feel like they have some kind of purpose or community and a place to go. But they also are more likely to endorse misogynistic beliefs. They're more likely to report that their mental health is really failing. And so we can look at all kinds of causes, like why does this manosphere exist? Obviously technology, obviously changing trends. But in 1977, there was a book written called The Hazards of Being Male. And it was a book that talked about all of the struggles that men face. And of course, this wasn't like a bestseller. This didn't take off because of course in the 70s and before, you know, we had like a feminism movement where we had to really focus on groups that had been really disadvantaged and did not have a voice at all. And so I think that some of the manosphere is a part of not talking about men and masculinity in different ways, right? That we now realize are problematic, but we're just kind of thinking that it wasn't much of a problem. If you could move to the next slide, please. So education is also really, really changing. For anybody who's on a college campus, you're less likely to see men enrolled in college programs. It's been featured on all kinds of news programs about men entering the workforce with far less educational credentials than women. And of course, Black men, boys are more susceptible. They are entering the workforce with the fewest number of educational credentials. And this affects, you know, Black families. This affects generational wealth. And so this is particularly affecting this community. And, you know, Black boys have fewer role models in schools. There is a crisis of having like Black educators or men of color as role models in like K through 12 institutions. Boys also who are in the lower fifth of the economic bracket, they're less likely than women to ever get out of that bracket. So, you know, the idea that you work hard or you can, you know, get your way out of poverty for some men, like that seemingly is less of a reality than is available to other people. So you think about that economic anxiety, you think about those masculine norms, and then you think about getting hooked on manosphere content. It is like the perfect storm. And men who are, you know, in this space are much more likely to identify with misogynistic sources. If you move to the next slide, please. This is the last topic that I will share with regard to some of the problems facing men, and that is of violence. So violence of various kinds is very much a male-driven phenomenon. Most rape arrests are male. It does not mean that men do not get raped and do not get sexually assaulted, but the difference between men and women is vast. Most murders are committed by men, robberies, aggravated assaults. These are staggering statistics again, right? Like really, really all on one side. But if you look on the flip side, these crimes are committed by a much smaller portion of men. And so the tails, right, of like the bell curve are really kind of populated with the men that like we're really, really concerned about. But it is interesting again to go back to almost my first slide that far more men die by suicide than are murdered. And male on male violence is, you know, a significant problem. So men are not just hurting people of other genders, but they are hurting each other. So next we're going to move on to why. If you could go to the next slide, please. So I do want to mention before I go into the why that there are so many issues that I did not mention, right? Talking about homelessness, reduced life expectancy of men versus women. Many of you may have heard that like the average life expectancy for men is 5 years shorter. Male health diseases that, you know, do not get addressed by many men. And so there are many topics that I did not address, but I just picked a few today. But if we get into the why, first, I'm going to start with nature. So we talk about, you know, nurture versus nature, and nurture can be a difficult thing to talk about because sometimes it's been used as an excuse, right? You know, this idea that, okay, well, boys and men have testosterone, so boys will be boys, and like that's just the way they are. This is old thinking. We don't need to think that way. And also the research, you know, that talked about, you know, testosterone, like was also old research that did not have as much nuance in it. So I will say, right, like when I talk about nature, I'm not talking about like these are fixed things, that this is where we are in terms of our understanding now, which is very different from what our understanding used to be. And of course, testosterone is the number one thing we talk about in terms of biological differences. One used to think that just simply a man boy might have had more testosterone, so it makes them more prone to violence or that kind of direct link to behavior. But the research now shows that it's not so simple, that it's very context dependent, right? We talk about nurture and nature being interlinked. We talk about epigenetic changes, which can happen like real time in the moment, can change over the course of one person's lifetime. And that testosterone, like even if you measure, you know, someone's aggression in the moment, it doesn't necessarily correlate with testosterone. If you're even to ask a man to track like sexual arousal and measure testosterone levels, like that doesn't always even correlate. But there are links. There are absolutely links, and they're context dependent. Some really have to do with courtship, and even men, like once they their partner has a baby, like there is a noticeable drop in testosterone, which is likely evolutionarily linked because it keeps a man like closer to his child and to his family. And finally, one thing that Richard Reeves talks about in his book, it's called Of Boys and Men. And Richard Reeves is the director of the American Institute of Boys and Men. I would say that he's the most prominent voice in the public sphere. And he talks about the need to redshirt boys. Now, he talks about that because he talks about some of these developmental differences, that boys are more sensitive and that they need like an extra year maybe and be redshirted or held back a year in school as compared to girls. And some of the research suggests that as newborns into the age of 1, boys are more sensitive than girls. And so there are some of these differences that occur, you know, in terms of biology. So if we move to masculine norms asterisks, I want to talk about socialization. Socialization starts from before birth, right? Socialization and what is okay for boys and what is okay for girls. It's already in our culture before someone even like conceives a child, right? So the quickest way to think about it is blue is for boys and pink is for girls. People painting their nurseries like gender appropriate colors, which I think has really changed, you know, in years. But we are all socialized. And unless our parents choose to do it differently, and there is variation, right? Like it's not so black and white, but we are socialized according to gender norms. And gender norms are not just about the colors that we wear, but it's about the behaviors that we have. It shapes our personalities. And boys are likely to be shaped in ways that could be problematic to them. I will also talk about like a little caveat before I describe some of these masculine norms that I have here on the screen, which is that there's been a lot of frustration in the field of psychology, which is why like a lot of diversity courses exist, because men have been the group that has been studied the most. And that's frustrating, right? Because like, what about everybody else? But one thing I will say that is the caveat is that the research used men as the norm, but it did not like delineate like what part of like masculinity or being a man or, you know, male hormones like is a part of that norm. Like it just used men as like a stand-in, but not like kind of pull a masculinity apart. So while we do have the research with men as norm, it's not necessarily as helpful as one would think. And so that's why at Division 51, and there's researchers across the country who are not a part of the division that does a lot of male research, created these norms to study like how some of the ways men and boys are socialized like affects them kind of in different ways that are problematic. And another caveat before I go into the norms too is that masculine norms are not necessarily bad, right? It is not bad to be socialized in some ways that both both genders are, but it is more so like a rigid adherence that like I have to be this way and this way and this way and this way, and that there's no flexibility, that there's no I can be this way in this situation, but in this situation I can like kind of shift and be a little bit more flexible. So you'll see the CMNI and the MRNI. These are two of the most widely used masculine norm scales. They're, normed and everything. But you'll see on the left, the one is like winning. This is like a masculine norm. And actually what research allows, people to do is see like winning is actually positively correlated with well-being, as long as you don't take winning at the expense of others, but generally like winning makes us, compete and be our best selves. And so there can be a good connotation to a norm. And then there are some that are less desirable, like risk-taking, violence, power over women. And again, researchers are trying to see which one of the norms like correlate with, bad behavior for men and for others, as well as which ones might be good. If you can move to the next slide, I'll just linger on this one very shortly, but this was developed by Sandra Bem in the 70s, and she just talked about like framing masculinity and femininity like in all positive terms, right? And so just to know that there are different ways to frame various norms. If you can move to the next slide, and this will be my final slide for talking about the why, though there is much, much more to talk about why. And this is my own point, though I think that other people talk about this, is this idea of stereotype threat. Now, stereotype threat is most associated with the research of, how people from minority backgrounds, you know, go to take some kind of standardized testing, and like there is like this idea that you're not going to perform well as like your white counterparts, or women like not performing as well in math as their male counterparts. And we know that people like absorb this information from the culture, and even directly if there's information that comes to them directly before taking a test, and it affects the way that they behave. And so personally, I would argue that while everything that we've talked about so far like is relevant and is true and is researched about men, like we do have to be careful about how we can also project and assume that everyone is going to be, doing these things in line with like male behavior, and can actually create more of it, right? Like and same way of stereotype threat. And I found a couple studies that were interesting. I won't talk about them long, but like even men on a math test, when, kind of explain that they might not do as well as another racial background, they actually do worse on the test. And another stereotype threat on social sensitivity, which could be seen as a little bit more in line with, male gender norms, when kind of like told that they might not do as well as women in noticing other people's emotions and reading social cues and communicating, they actually did worse on the test. And so, right, like we want to be careful that when we talk directly to our boys and men, like what are we saying? Like we're saying, hey, here's a problem, but like let's also make sure we're not communicating that, immediately boys are bad, because that is a lot of what is going on in the media. So next is solutions. This is the part that makes me much more excited to talk about solutions rather than problems. But of course, understanding problems and understanding why they're happening is critical. I think that we have to like figure out how to help boys and men. Socialization is an unconscious process, right? Like when boys are raised to suppress emotions and to use externalizing behaviors or internalizing in the case of suicide, we have to like pause and help them and not just kind of point the finger. So if you move to the next slide, there are researchers who actually have created a like kind of side movement in terms of research and called positive masculinity. And they created a scale. I've written down here some the specific facets of this scale. But these are all framed like positively, right? If we think about the culture right now, one of the things that we're hearing from men is like, this is not fair. We're just being painted in an all negative light. And there's a lot of discussion to have about that, right? People are understandably angry. People are upset about things like, and there are also positive aspects of masculinity. So even just like some of my favorite is, of course, like use of humor or banding together and things like that. And if we zoom out to a more cultural level of setting example, so thank you for that slide. You know, we are seeing a huge increase in men speaking out about mental health. I'm a Good Morning America junkie, so I have Good Morning America every morning when I get ready for work. And sometimes I just do a double take because I saw The Rock like a couple of years ago talking about his mental health struggles. And it was just, oh, it makes me want to just tear up the bravery, right, to come out when men are in a, you know, have been, in a culture where you don't talk about those things. Our very own AJ Brown on the bottom left, dude came out before the Super Bowl and talked about his, feelings of wanting to end his life. I mean, it doesn't get more like brave and quite frankly, like manly than that. Like that is amazing. So all the other people on this slide have all been open. And I think we need so much more of that. We need more of this type of stuff rather than some of the misogynistic stuff of the manosphere. And if you move to the next slide, there are key players in the space of trying to do research to understand the problems facing boys and men. So I've referenced Richard Reeves. He's the head of the American Institute for Boys and Men. I really recommend his book of Boys and Men. Movember is, if you see men wear mustaches in November, this is a suicide awareness campaign started by the Movember Foundation. They also do lots of research. Of course, Society for the Psychology of Men and Masculinities. I have mentioned them because I am a part of that organization. And of course, Equimundo, who's doing a lot of social justice-based research for men. So these are, we need to keep doing much more research, and these players are really important. But in the next slide, one of the things that I really appreciate is that there's local organizations changing the narrative too. There are positive influencers, and there's right now, I just saw something from a joint project between Movember and Equimundo, trying to find influencers who can talk on a positive way, in a positive way, and to replace, kind of the Andrew Tates of the world. There's a group called Men Living. I love to refer people to this group. They have groups every single day for men to talk about various kinds of problems. It's amazing. The Dad Letter Project is so lovely. Have dads like writing letters to people who need just like a positive male model, and all these organizations take donations, by the way. And on the left side is Reddit, which is a place that has often been talked about being filled with kind of like men's rights type followers. There's a thread called Celebrating Men where men and women post like their positive experiences with men, right? So that men know that it's like not just all this like negative talk about like them, and that people appreciate and see the positive and good things that men already do. So, right, kind of along the lines of positive masculinity. And if we move to my last slide, please. The thing that gives me the most hope, and this came out yesterday or the day before, so I was like, I had to put it in here because this inflection point, which is the absolute best way to put it, is like where we are right now. This is such good news that a silent majority support talking about men's mental health. A lot of women, like more women even than men, based on this sample. And that there's bipartisan support. Governor Gavin Newsom in California, Gretchen Whitmer, people who are on the progressive side who realize after the election that they've been kind of progressive and not been talking about men, maybe in a way that's reaching them positively, really need to start like thinking about it. And if you look at the graph, it's a lot of bars there, so I'll explain it. But men want to talk about manhood more than masculinity. So on the top, there's a question that's phrased. So there's three groups: all US men, male Harris voters, male Trump voters. And they asked this two questions to these groups. And they said, how likely would you be to have a conversation with your friends about what it means to be a man today? Or they phrased the question, how likely would you be to have a conversation with your friends about masculinity? And the first question about what it means to be a man today brought a lot more men to the table from both sides of the aisle, or specifically the Trump side of the aisle, of wanting to talk about these issues. And so the important message here is that the way you phrase these conversations around hot topic issues, I'm sure we would see something similar about any other hot button issue, is really, really important. That we have to, understand, people's psychology before even getting into conversations about it. So if you could move to the next slide, we can talk about anything as a group now. Some people might have to leave, but I'd ask yourself to now rate on the 1 to 10 scale, like how much of an understanding you feel like you have of men's issues. And I'm really curious how like men's issues affects people's individuals' work here in this audience, or how it affects their life. And any emotions that may have been brought up. If you want to stop sharing, we can kind of have a conversation about some of the content that we talked about today. Does anybody want to start with like questions or just feelings that came up during this?
I'm happy to start. So I'm a therapist at a community mental health site in Philadelphia. And as I've evolved as a therapist, I've ended up gravitating toward working with men, and which was very surprising. But something that was also very fascinating was within talking about masculinity and manhood within the context of what was modeled to them growing up, and then also what do they want to model to their children. And just thinking a lot of how modeling has a role, and even just the space that I am creating for them. Sometimes people just don't want to be judged and not held to the certain expectations of how to show up in a space. And I also think something I've noticed, that especially working with clients who have history of violence and violence against women, I've noticed a lot how much our society underplays the role of psychological safety. So somebody may feel, oh, if someone's in proximal harm physically, that's one thing. But even something like raising one's voice, if that has been modeled as the thing that is the precursor to physical violence happening, the circuit gets a little bit shorter so that somebody's going to feel on guard. And so it's been very fascinating to see that sometimes people are activated by a raise of voice, feeling misunderstood, feeling judged, and people just want to feel seen. So that's been my experience. So I appreciate you sharing your background as well.
Yeah, Jackie, I loved all your points. Those were so well stated, and it's awesome you're doing work with men. And yeah, I mean, I think just like modeling that we're in a therapy session where I'm not judging you and I'm giving you a space to talk about this, like, right, it goes with my last slide about like, what kind of man do you want to be, right? And just like modeling that you can choose to be the type of person you want to be. Like, you don't have to adhere to like these norms or standards that you were raised by. So that like, that's awesome that you're doing the work. And to talk about, like women's, like psychological safety, that is such an important point. So when I think about the page where it talks about, like male violence, you're right. Like there are all these things that come before violence, and we're a very smart species. So we pick up on cues way before like any kind of violence could happen. Right. And so it makes sense that women would have that anxiety and have a shorter fuse. That shorter fuse is there for protection. Right. And so like to validate that, and for men to understand that, right? When I look at like the sexual assault statistics before I was like preparing, and it was just like it's like mind numbing, like how many women have been victims of some kind of sexual assault. And so like you have to do things like to constantly keep you safe. And part of that might be to like look at everybody as a potential threat, right? Because we all have to do things to keep our self safe when there are statistics like that.
And I do want to clarify too that I've noticed that the lack of psychological safety really shows up in the men I work with, and how that they quickly draw those connections, that even if they are activated, they can equate lack of psychological safety with lack of physical safety. So it's definitely something that I've seen with my male clients as well.
Can you like break that down a little bit, like what you mean? Because I don't know if everybody here is a psychologist and like what that means.
Sure. So a lot of times this comes to like emotional regulation in our nervous system. And so even if somebody raises their voice at us, or my stress response might come out. I might start to feel dysregulated. I might start to use a stress response like fight, flight, freeze, or fawn. And when that's the case, our prefrontal cortex goes out the window, like our ability to reason. And so something like a raising one's voice, even if someone of any gender is on the receiving end of that, and the raising of one's voice, even if it's not intentional, if that has been tied to them, that is the precursor to violence, then one may easily assume that even if they're just feeling psychologically unsafe or feeling like they're in like survival mode,
Yep.
they might quickly draw that comparison of, oh, I don't feel, I feel in survival mode right now. I need to square up and respond physically. And so, and equating those two things, and what is the difference between feeling uncomfortable and feeling in danger? So that, I hope that clarification helps.
Yeah, no, it was really good. Thank you for shouting that out. I know Samir, your hand went up as Jackie
Yeah.
was talking, so I
Yeah. Well, first of all, thank you, Erica, so much for this and all the research and work you do in this area and for the series. Yeah, I've got a lot going on in my head and my heart. I'm also a therapist, although I focus mainly on parts IFS therapist. So the premise being that we consist of a multitude of parts that were born at different times, play different roles, et cetera, et cetera. And just to give like a little bit of a different visual, I'm thinking a lot about on the topic of psychological safety, like the paradox or the irony of, as Erica mentioned, with like male, especially white men, obviously being higher material privilege, just how much um, parts of themselves from the past, traumatized parts that they're unsure of, have been basically silenced through socialization, and how some of these things that were even mentioned around like um, the instinct to react or to automatically have a behavior in a situation is driven by defensive parts. And so, I mean, the visual I always go to is like, generally speaking, thinking of people as buildings and parts inside the buildings, especially, childhood parts, traumatized parts, etc. And on the outside of the building, how we create these defensive scaffolds, right? So like these coping mechanisms, that could be drugs, that could be humor, that could be intellectualization, and how both across the board and with the men I've worked with, just the depth to which, and this is a big part of this socialization, but the depth to which like leaning in to feelings or parts that are against the narrative of masculinity, of being strong, of even having any kind of doubt or loss of control, how that is absolutely um, unspeakable, unthinkable, can't go there, and how a lot of the outward behaviors that men have are a result of this inability to access one's inner world. And I don't know. So that's like, for me, that's the biggest aspect of this that resonates. And how do we create the containers such that we can allow people the space to break down those scaffolds? And that doesn't come through force. That those parts are doing what they're doing, right? Those scaffolds to protect. And how do we? And the challenge, the last point here is, speaking of things like social media, Reddit, it feels like, especially in a binary world of digital media, that more often than not, the tools that are out there do more to reinforce those external scaffolds versus providing the pathways for people to be more nuanced or to lean into difficult or unknown or, all of that world. And that's one of the areas that I despair in a little bit more, is how we're creating those containers versus not. and how we absolutely, and this goes across different gender demographics, different kinds of, you could apply this to like MAGA folks, for example, not to get too political, but the idea of how do you, when folks are down a path of they're behaving from parts that are in major defensive mode all the time, how do we pull that back and give people a space in which to have those parts kind of maybe stand aside so that we can do deeper work? Sorry, that was like fairly abstract, but yeah.
I think that the meta is necessary. I want to jump to Cayetana because I feel like you have to leave, and you're also signed in with my name, which is awesome.
I know. I have no idea how it happened, but I'm happy to be Erica Liebman 2.0. So we're good. So sorry, everyone. I am not also named Erica Liebman. I am Cayetana Calderon Smith. I'm also a psychotherapist. I love that we're all kind of saying the same thing around our commentary. I'm really thinking about stereotype threat and hegemonic masculinity. And I'm specifically wondering if stereotype threat really could help us understand even achievement gaps within groups of men, right? Like if we have some men who perceive themselves to be or experience the world as being able to access more, right? Versus other men who may be able to access less. And then when we couple that in with what we learned about today, kind of the rigidity associated with coping styles and how it may be more difficult for men to engage, right? Could these concepts of stereotype threat and hegemonic masculinity help us understand some of what we're seeing with both this variance in outcomes and also even the issues we're facing today?
Super good point.
Thank you. Thank you. Sorry, one thing I know we have to be really quick.
Yeah.
Totally regarding what Samir said about like the reinforcement of social media, echo chambers, right? And filter bubbles. Now we're all looking at different content and how that can be a really significant reinforcing tool, I think is important to think about also.
Samir, did you want to say something to what Cayetana was saying? Because I saw you raise your hand.
No, that was a mistake.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I mean, go ahead. Sorry,
Sure,
Andrew.
I'd just like to nudge others if you'd like to jump in, and those who haven't had a chance to chime in yet.
Andrew, I'll say something quickly. Erica identified with so much of what you talked about. Just a little context. I'm the son of a father who was the oldest of 14 children, 12 of whom were males, and they were mostly construction workers and
Oh,
manifested
wow.
many of the things we're talking about. And I became a psychologist and professor, probably in reaction to a lot of my upbringing. But the main point I wanted to make is I've been a professor for over 30 years, and I never forget the fact that I'm a white male in my work with my students, especially women, and try to make my office, for example, a safe space where women feel they can be vulnerable with me as a male professor, white male of privilege and power in the academic institution, because I'm aware of what it means. And it's kind of connected to your point about creating alternative narratives of masculinity. And I try to underscore the role of care, that men can care and be caring and be safe. And it's been an ethic that I would never cross the line of being inappropriate with a student of mine, but in particular women, sexually or aggressively. In fact, Jackie and I have had a tense moment once where she taught me something about what she just shared, where I raised my voice, not really thinking about it in a more intense argument, and not being aware of the impact it might have on a woman in my world. So there's just so much to take from this. But I would say that I reflect on some aspect of this talk every day for my work. I'm also the father of two boys, two adult young men. So I try to pass these messages along because I think they are so profoundly critical. Men can do so much good and so much harm, and we need to be aware of it.
Yeah, I think one of the things as you were talking, I was reflecting that as I was putting together the talk about how much more I learned about women's issues by learning about men's issues, right? Like just combing through more data, like it's like they're interconnected. Like we can't talk about men's issues in a silo. And the more men's work I do, the more I realize like why women feel the way that they do. And, it becomes this tug of war like problem, like in like political conversations, where, people are coming at it from like trying to figure out who's winning which side, right? And like there might be like a lot of men out there be like, well, not all men are like this. And like that's not really the way to to state it. It's kind of like, hey, like I get that a lot of men can be like this, and I hope I can do more than the other instead of like defending a position. But we get into that way of talking about things on all kinds of issues, and it's a problem.
Yeah, the other thing I would mention is the sometimes the false dichotomy in masculinity. My father, for example, was probably the most loving man I ever knew, but also extremely aggressive and scared me and scared other people. So that there's that complexity as well, that it's not an either or scenario. It's a very complex reality that many men have to try to navigate.
Mhm, mhm.
I think Darren.
Yep. Hello. I'm not a psychotherapist. I'm not even in the mental health field. I'm a polymer chemist, but I really enjoyed this presentation. And I think my question was for Michael because I just had a recent experience with a work colleague that was from a foreign country. And a lot of things stood out to me um, about his behavior. And then I look at Michael and what he just said about how he's conscious of how he behaves in front of women and just other people in general, understanding that he's a white man. Um, where this gentleman who I was working with and spent the last 10 days with visiting customers was, I think, just the opposite. Had really negative things to say about women, was very, very misogynistic, very, very, I would put him in the camp of a nice Andrew Tate type of person. And I just wonder, from Michael's perspective, like, how did he come to say, okay, I need to be different. I need to be aware. Because talking to this, my work colleague, I wouldn't even know where to start with someone like that. Like the only thing I did was just push back whenever he would say something negative about women. I would just say something along the lines, understand that we work together, along the lines of, yeah, I don't see it that way. Like I don't agree with you. Um,
I'm
Yeah,
gonna
I get triggered by these things, Darren, regularly when I hear men talk about women in these stereotyped ways. And I'll just say a couple of things. Turn it over to, I know Erica has thoughts about this. But since you mentioned me, I'll give you this perspective on it. We start from very different places. So whatever demographic we talk about is just one of many parts of the house, to go back to one of our participants' metaphors. And I would say part of what has helped me along the way is I had an extremely loving mother who helped me navigate my relationship with my father. And not everyone's that fortunate. Many of the stories we hear in therapy are about parents who didn't protect their kids from the other parent or from predators or things to that effect. I think the responses, Darren, are probably too complex for me to summarize quickly, but being aware, somehow having our awareness sparked and recognizing that all humans deserve dignity and we need to do our best to support the dignity of other people, whether they're similar to us or different, is the call as I see it. But how to get there is an extraordinary challenge. But Erica, I'll turn it back over to
Yeah.
you.
Well, I was gonna say in response to Darren's comment is that I mean the place where you ideally start from is one of just like curiosity, be like, why does this person think this way? But it's very difficult when the person's in your life, right? It's so easy for me to say that because I encounter people like this in the therapy room, and I really enjoy working with narcissism. Like it's kind of like, and I have people who do qualify for the diagnosis on my caseload, and like when I'm done the session, I mean, I'm like, phew, you know, or if they leave and don't want to do therapy anymore, there are moments where I'm like, phew. But it's like, it's fascinating because a lot of them have horrible relationships with their mothers, like squash their like points of view. I mean, not even like directly said like this is what it is to be a man, but just say like you are my appendage. Like they themselves might be narcissistic and they themselves might have had all kinds of trauma too, right? And so I think that your point about, you know, your relationship with your mother like sparked that in me because I've seen it clinically. You know, and again, like we just can't talk about men without women. It's just like that conversation can't happen. So, I know we're at time, so I just want to thank everybody for coming. It was lovely to meet everybody and yeah, have the conversation.
Absolutely.
And Andrew and Erica, no, I have to jump to another meeting that I'm supposed to be in, but I just want to thank you, Erica, for initiating this conversation. I think it could go on endlessly,
It could, yeah.
and more of it should happen. Maybe we can have you back at another time.
Sounds good.
Thank you all.
All right.
Thanks, Mike.
Have a good day.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.